Montana Territory, 1879. The rain had not stopped in 3 days, and the Missouri River was swollen and brown, dragging branches and silt through its furious current. Kade Alden reined in his wet horse at the edge of the riverbank just past dawn, eyes narrowing at something pale half submerged in the mud. It was a woman, arms tied behind her back, dress soaked and clinging to her like second skin, her face turned to the side, lips trembling as she tried to breathe through the muck. "God Almighty," Kade muttered, kicking his boots free of the stirrups and sliding down into the thick, cold sludge. He splashed into the shallows without hesitation, reaching for her. Her body barely stirred, but her eyes flicked up wild, terrified, and still burning with life. "I got you," he said, voice low and steady. "You're not dying here." Her breath hitched when he pulled the rope from her wrists. She collapsed into him, too weak to stand. Kade lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest as he trudged back up the bank. She was freezing, lips blue, skin scratched and bruised. Someone had meant for her to die out there. "You got a name?" Kade asked, settling her gently onto his horse and throwing his coat around her shoulders. She blinked slowly, voice hoarse. Jessa Paxton." He swung up behind her, holding her steady with one arm. "Well, Jessa Paxton, let's get you warm before you turn to stone." He turned his horse toward his cabin, tucked up in the hills a half-day's ride from the river. The whole way there, she clung to the warmth of his coat and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat behind her. She did not speak again, but Kade felt her breathing slow, her trembling ease slightly. When they reached the cabin, he carried her inside without asking, laying her down gently on the cot near the stove. He stoked the fire high, brought water to a boil, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. She watched him from the cot with guarded eyes. Her hands were raw, wrists bruised deep. Kade knelt in front of her with a tin cup of warm broth and offered it without a word. She drank it slow, her voice finally strong enough to rasp out. "Why did you help me?" Kade looked at her, jaw tightening. "Because no one should be left like that, not ever." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "They left me for dead, tied me there when I ran." Kade's gaze sharpened. "Who did?" "My fiancé's brothers," she whispered, staring into the cup. "They said I was a burden. That I was better off gone." He sat back on his heels, anger flaring in his chest. "You were going to marry into that kind of filth," she nodded once. "He was the only one who ever showed me kindness. When he died, they turned mean, said I had no place without him. I tried to run. They caught me." Kade let out a breath, slow and steady. "You do not owe me your story, but you are safe here. No one's coming through that door without me knowing." A flicker of trust passed through her eyes, small but real. She leaned back into the pillow, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was going to die in that mud." "You did not," Kade said. "You are here now, that matters." By nightfall, she had color back in her cheeks and could sit up on her own. Kade cooked beans and cornbread, and they ate in quiet together. She watched him with a gaze that lingered longer than caution alone. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "I do." "No wife," he shook his head. "Never found one who wanted this life." Jessa looked around the cabin, simple, clean, quiet. "It is not the worst place I have ever been." Kade glanced at her. "You can stay as long as you need. I have room." She nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug of tea he gave her. "Thank you for everything." He sat across from her, one arm resting on the table, his eyes steady on hers. "You do not need to thank me, but I am glad I found you." Her lips parted slightly, something soft blooming in her expression. She looked at him with that same quiet strength he had seen in her when she came up gasping from the river mud like a woman who had fought to survive and would not break now. "I am glad too," she said, and her voice was no longer shaking. That night, Kade laid a blanket and pillow on the floor for himself, letting her have the cot. She watched him from the bed, her gaze warm and thoughtful. "You do not have to sleep on the floor," she said quietly. "I do," he replied with a small smile. "You need the rest more than I do." She did not argue again, but as the fire crackled low and the wind howled outside, she whispered, "Good night, Kade." "Good night, Jessa." And in the silence that followed, something gentle settled between them like the first breath after nearly drowning. He had found her in the mud, half dead and shaking, and carried her into his home. She was not just a stranger anymore, not now, not after that. And deep in his chest, Kade felt the first stirrings of something he had never expected to feel out here in the wild hills of Montana, a pull, a warmth, a beginning. By the second morning, the clouds had thinned to a dull gray and frost clung to the scrub outside. Inside the cabin, the stove gave off a low, steady heat. Jessa stood by the window, her bare feet tucked under the hem of a wool skirt Kade had dug from a chest. It was a little short, likely stitched by a sister or mother long gone, but warmer than anything she had left. Kade was outside splitting kindling, the sound of the axe clean and rhythmic. She watched him for a long while, arms crossed, unsure what to do with the quiet easing in her chest. The man had saved her life, but it was the way he moved now with calm purpose, without looking back for thanks, that made her feel like she wasn't just a burden being carried. When he finally came in, his hands were red from the cold, a few wood chips clinging to his sleeves. "You're up early," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "You didn't tell me there was a creek behind the hill," she replied, not turning from the window. He set the axe down by the door. "Didn't think you'd be up to walking yet." "I'm not," she said, her voice catching slightly. "But I saw the tree line bend that way, figured there was water." "You see everything, don't you?" "Had to learn quick," she said, her eyes flicked to him. "You always this quiet?" He hung his coat by the fire, then took the kettle off the hook to pour water into a basin. "Only when there's nothing worth shouting about." She stepped back as he brought the basin over to the table. He set a clean cloth beside it, then glanced at her wrists. "Let me see." She hesitated, then held them out. The marks were deep, rimmed with scabs, and the skin still mottled. Kade dipped the cloth in the warm water and began dabbing gently, careful not to hurt her more. "They kept horses," she said, watching his hands. "2 bays and a gray. The gray had a limp. I could hear it favoring the left side when they rode off." "You think they'll come looking?" She shook her head. "They don't like questions. Letting me vanish was cleaner." He wrung out the cloth, eyes narrowed. "That gray horse, it wouldn't make it far in the brush." "Not fast anyway." She met his gaze. "You planning to go after them?" "Not unless they come here." Jessa exhaled slowly and sat on the edge of the table. The cabin creaked softly as wind pushed against the logs. She looked around the room, then down at the floorboards near the hearth. "There's a knothole there that looks like a crow's eye," she said. He followed her gaze. "Never noticed. I used to look for shapes in the walls, made it easier when the nights were long." He nodded once, then stood and poured the water outside. When he came back in, he brought a small lidded tin from the shelf. "This'll help with the soreness," he said, offering her the salve. She opened it, sniffed the faint pine scent. "You make this?" "I trade for it with a woman up near Fort Benton. She's Crow, knows plants better than any doctor." Jessa rubbed a little between her fingers, then onto her wrists. "I never knew anyone from the tribes. We weren't allowed to speak to them." Kade leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "I was raised to think the same. Then I nearly lost a leg to a rusted nail, and she's the one who fixed me up. After that, I stopped listening to what folks said and started watching what they did." Her smile was faint but real. "That's a rare thing. I don't see much use in pretending something's true just because it's said loud." She turned her hands palm up and studied the fading bruises. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I have nothing, no money, no kin, no trade." "You can read?" he asked. "Yes, right, well enough. You're already ahead of most folks out here." She looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You offering me work, I'm offering you a place to stand until you find your feet. If that means work, I won't stop you." She tilted her head. "You always taken strays, only the ones who know the shape of hunger." Her gaze softened and she stood, walking slowly to the fire. "You don't owe me anything, Kade." He stayed where he was, the firelight catching the edge of his jaw. "Neither do you." They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Jessa reached for the kettle and poured 2 cups, handing one to him. Their fingers brushed just for a second. "I never had black coffee before," she said after sipping. "Always had to stretch it with milk or chicory. Strong's better when the days are cold." She looked toward the window again. "I'd like to see the creek when I can." "You will, when you're ready." She held his gaze, the warmth between them still new but steady. Maybe I'll find a use for myself here. He didn't answer right away. Then, you already have. Jessa didn't reply, but a quiet breath left her lips, and for the first time in too many weeks, it wasn't from fear or pain. It was something else, something that felt like beginning again, this time on her own terms. By the end of the week, the snow had melted in patches, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and thawed earth. Jessa stood at the edge of the small clearing behind the cabin, the hem of her borrowed skirt brushing the tops of brittle grass. A line of crows circled above the trees, slow and watchful, their wings cutting clean through the pale sky. She didn't flinch at their shadows. Kade was kneeling beside a half-split log, sharpening his drawknife on a whetstone. He didn't speak, but she felt the weight of his awareness, the way his eyes flicked to her now and then without urgency. It was a comfort she hadn't known she'd needed. She walked over, careful not to catch her boots in the uneven ground. "You always carve your fence posts by hand," he nodded once. "Makes the wood last longer. Store-bought ones rot fast. I'd like to help." He turned the drawknife in his palm, then offered it to her handle first. "You know how to use one?" "Not yet." He set the log steady between a wedge of rocks and crouched beside her. "Pull with your elbows, not your wrists. Let the blade do the work." Her fingers curled around the handle. The steel was cold, the wood warm from his grip. She tried once, the draw shaky, shallow. "Hold tighter here," he said, guiding her hand. His touch was light but sure, the heat of his skin grounding. She adjusted, tried again. A thin curl of wood peeled away from the log. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "That felt right." He gave a small nod. "Takes practice, you'll get it." They worked in silence after that. Jessa carved slowly, carefully, while Kade moved from post to post, checking for splits. The sun crept higher and the wind picked up, tugging at the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out its claim. After a while, she set the drawknife down and leaned back on her heels. "Did you build this place yourself?" "Mostly. My brother helped set the beams before he went south. Is he still alive, as far as I know?" "Haven't seen him since the war ended." She traced a finger along the grain of the log. "I lost a brother too. Fever took him when I was 9. He didn't offer sympathy, just listened. She glanced up, her voice low. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, not really, but it's quiet here. Like the world stopped long enough to breathe." "It's not much," he said, brushing sawdust from his coat, "but it holds." She stood, brushing her skirt. "I'd like to see the creek today." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Come on." "It's not far." They followed a narrow path through the trees, snow crunching beneath their boots. The forest was still, save for the rustle of squirrels and the soft creak of branches overhead. Jessa walked with slow purpose, her shoulders no longer hunched, her steps no longer uncertain. When they reached the creek, it shimmered with meltwater, winding through moss-covered stones. She crouched at the edge, trailing her fingers in the current. "It's colder than I thought. Snowmelt comes fast this time of year." She watched the water swirl around her hand. "I used to think rivers were just something to cross. I never saw them as something that could carry you away." "They can do both," he said. "Depends how you meet them." She rose, brushing her hands dry on her skirt. "I don't want to be carried anymore." "Not unless I choose where I'm going." He met her eyes, steady and certain. "Then you won't be." A silence stretched between them, not heavy, just full. She took a step closer, her chin lifted. "I don't know what's ahead, Kade. I don't even know what I want some days. You don't have to know everything today." She reached out, fingers brushing the edge of his coat. "But I know I want to stay here with you." His breath caught barely, and then he stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Then stay." She nodded once, and he offered his hand. She took it. They walked back to the cabin side by side, not rushing, not speaking. The wind had quieted, the trees tall and still. Behind them, the creek ran on, clear and steady, carving its path through the thaw and stone. The snow was gone by the following week, leaving the earth damp and dark beneath the pines. Frost still clung to the mornings, but the land was stirring with the slow rhythm of spring. Kade had begun planting early onions in the narrow rows behind the cabin, and Jessa had taken to rising before the sun to boil water and set out bread to rise in the warmth near the stove. One morning, she stepped outside with a tin basin. sleeves rolled to her elbows. The air bit at her skin, but the light was gold through the trees, and the woods no longer looked like a place to hide from. Kade was down by the shed, hammering a new hinge into the chicken coop. She watched him for a moment, then crossed the yard with the basin balanced on her hip. "You ever keep bees?" she asked, crouching to rinse the basin in the rain barrel. "No," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Why?" "There's wild hives near the ridge. I saw the comb on a broken cedar yesterday. The bees were still flying." He leaned a shoulder against the post. "You've got a good eye. I worked in a boarding house kitchen once. The woman who ran it kept hives behind the laundry. She said the taste of honey changed with the flowers." Kade nodded toward the trees. "If you think it's worth trying, we'll build a box." She set the basin down and straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt. "I'd like that. I think it'd give me something to tend." He studied her a moment, then said, "You sleep through the night now, mostly." She glanced toward the hills. "I still wake sometimes, but it's different." "How so?" "I don't wake waiting for someone's hand around my throat." His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She stepped closer, her voice even. "It's not just the quiet here, it's you. You don't ask me to be anything." "I wouldn't know how to," he said. She smiled, but only briefly. "You've been alone a long time." "I've done most things alone." Jessa reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Do you ever miss noise, crowds, voices, motion?" "No," he said. "I miss conversation, but not the kind that fills silence just to hear itself." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "I think I could stay, not just out of need, but because this feels like something I could belong to." His voice was quiet. "You already do." A flicker passed through her expression, not surprise, not uncertainty, but something like steadiness finding its anchor. She walked past him then, toward the tree line, pausing only once. "I want to check how far those bees have spread. If we're going to do this, I want to learn what they're feeding on." "I'll come with you," she shook her head. "Let me go alone, just this once." He didn't argue, just watched her go, boots sure on the softening trail, her shoulders no longer drawn in against the world. That afternoon, she returned with 2 wild combs wrapped in cloth and the scent of cedar in her hair. Her hands were scratched and her cheeks flushed, but her eyes were bright. "They're strong," she said, holding up the bundle. "I didn't take much. Just enough to draw them down when we set up the box." Kade took the comb gently from her hands. "You did well." She lifted her chin. "I want to help build it." "All right," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." That night they sat by the stove, each with a mug of warm cider. The fire burned low and the wind was still. Jessa leaned back in the chair, eyelids heavy. "This is the first time I've wanted a future since before he died," she said. "Not the fiancé, my brother." Kade looked at her, his voice low. "That's worth holding on to." She turned toward him, her gaze unguarded. "I don't know what kind of woman I'll be here. I only know I want to be her with you in the picture." He didn't reach for her, didn't speak too soon. He only gave her the kind of look a man gives when he sees something unfolding that matters more than his own quiet. "You've already started," he said, and in the hush that followed, the fire cracked once, soft and certain. The cedar box took 3 days to finish, each board planed and notched by hand. Jessa handled the bees with a calm Kade hadn't expected, no flinching, no wasted movement. She wore a veil she'd sewn from spare muslin, and when the bees settled into their new home, she stood beside the box with her palm resting on the top, as though claiming it without needing to say so. By then, the land had begun to green. Shoots of wild onion pushed through the soil near the creek, and the cottonwoods along the ridge had started to bud. Kade found himself watching her more than he meant to, watching the way her mouth tightened when she concentrated, how she hummed softly when she worked alone, songs too faint to name. One evening, after supper, she set her fork down and looked across the table at him. "There's something I haven't told you." He didn't move, just waited. "It's about the man I was supposed to marry, the one whose brothers left me." Kade nodded once. He was kind at first, too kind maybe. "But he didn't see me. Not really. I was something to protect, not to know, and I let it happen because I didn't think there was another way to be wanted." She folded her hands in her lap. "When he died, I thought I'd lost the only place I'd ever belong, but I see it now that wasn't belonging. That was being kept." Cade leaned forward, elbows on the table, and now I'm not afraid of my own choices anymore. He stood and crossed to the hearth where the fire burned low. After a moment, he held out his hand. She rose and took it without hesitation. They stepped outside together. The night was clear, stars pricking the sky above the hills. A light breeze moved through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and warming soil. He led her to the edge of the porch, where her shawl hung on a peg. He draped it around her shoulders, fingers brushing her collarbone. "I never meant to want anything more than quiet," he said, "but you changed what quiet means." She turned to face him. "I don't want to be kept either," she said. "I want to be chosen, and I want to choose back." He looked at her for a long moment, then brought his hands to her face. "You are not a burden, Jessa. You never were." She leaned into him, eyes steady. "Then let's build something that doesn't start in fear." Their first kiss was slow and certain, the kind that came not from longing alone, but from the weight of everything they had lived through. When it ended, neither stepped back. That spring, they cleared more land behind the cabin, digging rows for beans and squash. Jessa traded honey at the settlement for a loom and began weaving cloth from wool bartered off a neighbor. Cade built her a table for it, sealing the legs so it wouldn't rock on the uneven floor. By summer, the bees had filled the cedar box with comb, and the garden gave more than they could eat. She dried herbs in bunches over the stove, and he added another room to the cabin, boards cut slow and fitted tight. One morning, she woke with her hand resting against the bare curve of his back, the sun just starting to rise through the window. "Do you regret letting me stay?" she whispered. He turned toward her, voice thick with sleep. "I regret not finding you sooner," she smiled, eyes soft. "Would you marry me, Kade Alden?" He blinked, then let out the smallest breath of surprise. "I was going to ask you next week. I finished carving the band." "I don't need a ring," she said. "You'll have it anyway." They married in the clearing near the creek, just the two of them and the wind in the trees. She wore a dress she dyed with walnut husks, and he tied her hair back with a strip of linen. He spoke his vows slow and clear, voice steady as the river. She answered with a hand pressed over his heart. They built a life from the bones of quiet things. A fence mended together, a cupboard filled with jars of preserves, a chair carved from pine where she read aloud by firelight. They spoke less than most, but when they did, it mattered. When the first snow came that winter, they stood at the window, arms around each other, watching it fall over the garden and the cedar hive and the path they'd worn between the porch and the trees. Jessa rested her head against his shoulder. "This is what I wanted," she said. He kissed her temple. "So did I." And that was the shape of their days from then on, two people who had been given up on, finding the kind of love that never asked for more than truth and gave back more than either had known to want.